There is something sacred about light and darkness, something that touches the human soul in ways that words struggle to capture. A single flame burning in the night speaks to us of hope persisting, of warmth maintained against cold, of presence in the midst of absence. For the people of medieval Europe, who lived through winters far darker and longer than most of us can truly imagine, light was not merely practical, but profoundly symbolic, a visible reminder that some things endure even when everything else seems to fail. Tonight, I want to share with you one of the most quietly beautiful miracle stories from the medieval Christian tradition, a tale that has been told in different forms across different regions, but always carrying the same essential truth. It is the story of a candle that would not go out, of light that persisted beyond all natural possibility, of a small miracle that brought hope to a community on the edge of despair during the darkest season of the year. The story is known by various names depending on where and when it was told. In some regions, it was called the eternal flame of Christmas. In others, the candle that burned for 12 days. Some versions referred to it simply as the miracle of the light, with no need for elaboration because the miracle was self-evident in the telling. What remained constant across all versions was the image at the heart of the story. A candle, small and ordinary, burning far longer than any natural candle could burn, providing light and warmth and hope to people who desperately needed all three. Like many medieval miracle stories, this tale cannot be pinned to a single location or date with historical precision. It belongs to that realm of folk memory where the boundaries between history and legend become permeable, where what matters is not whether every detail can be verified, but whether the story carries truth of a deeper kind, truth about human need and divine response, about faith and persistence, about how light operates both as physical phenomenon and spiritual metaphor. The story was told in monastery scriptoriums, where monks copied it into collections of miracle tales meant to inspire faith and offer comfort during difficult times. It was told by mothers to children on winter nights, passed down through generations as part of the family's spiritual inheritance. It was told by priests during Advent and Christmas sermons, used as a teaching tool to illustrate theological concepts about Christ as light of the world, about how divine presence manifests in ordinary objects and circumstances, about grace that sustains beyond natural limits. Medieval Christians lived in a world where winter was not an inconvenience, but a genuine trial of survival. The days shortened until there were barely a few hours of weak sunlight, leaving most of daily life to be conducted in darkness or by artificial light. The cold was severe, penetrating stone walls and wooden shutters, making every moment outside a test of endurance. Food grew scarce as stored supplies dwindled and no fresh crops could be harvested. Illness spread more easily in the close quarters where families huddled together for warmth. Death was a constant presence, more active in winter than any other season, claiming the very young and the very old and the already weak with ruthless efficiency. In this context, light took on enormous significance. Candles were expensive, made from precious beeswax or rendered tallow, requiring resources that poor families could not always spare. Yet light was necessary for work that had to continue even in winter darkness, for the basic activities of daily life, for maintaining some sense of normalcy and hope when everything outside was dark and cold and threatening. A family's supply of candles had to be carefully rationed, used sparingly, each lighting a calculation of necessity against scarcity. But candles were also deeply symbolic, carrying meanings that went far beyond their practical function. They represented prayer, often lit before icons or in churches as visible manifestations of spiritual devotion. They symbolized Christ himself, the light that came into the world's darkness at Christmas, the illumination that no darkness could overcome. They spoke of the human soul, a small light that must be kept burning through the trials of earthly existence. They embodied hope, the conviction that darkness is not the final word, that light persists, that warmth and illumination are possible even in the coldest, darkest times. So when medieval people told stories about miraculous candles, about flames that would not die when they should, about light that persisted beyond natural possibility, they were speaking in a language rich with layers of meaning. They were talking about physical survival and spiritual endurance simultaneously, about God's provision in material and metaphysical terms, about the ways that small things, a single candle, a humble prayer, a quiet faith, could matter enormously when circumstances became desperate. The Christmas candle story captured all of this. It was told during Advent and the 12 days of Christmas, that sacred season when Christians celebrated the birth of Christ, the entry of divine light into human darkness. It reminded listeners that miracles could be quiet and gentle, that divine intervention did not always come as dramatic spectacle, but could manifest as simple persistence, as the natural order being gently suspended just enough to provide what was desperately needed, as grace that sustained without fanfare or announcement. Tonight, as we settle into this story, let us try to imagine ourselves in that medieval world, in that winter darkness, in that state of need where a candle's light meant more than we can easily comprehend from our position of abundance and security. Let us meet the people to whom this miracle came, understand their struggles and their faith, and witness with them the quiet wonder of light that would not die, of hope that persisted when all logic said it should be extinguished. The village where our story takes place was small even by medieval standards. Perhaps 30 or 40 families living in timber-frame cottages clustered around a stone church that had served the community for generations. The cottages were modest structures, their walls made of wood and wattle and daub, their roofs thatched with straw or reeds that had to be maintained constantly to keep out the rain and snow. Each cottage typically had just 1 or 2 rooms, with a central hearth providing both heat for warmth and a place for cooking. The windows were small, covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters, for glass was expensive and rare, affordable only for churches and the homes of the wealthy. This was farming country, though not rich farming country. The soil was adequate but not generous, requiring hard work to produce even modest yields. The growing season was short, compressed between late spring frosts and early autumn cold, leaving farmers in a constant race to plant, tend, and harvest before winter returned. The surrounding forest provided wood for fuel and building, game for hunting when it could be found, mushrooms and berries during the warmer months. A stream ran near the village, providing water and occasional fish, though it often froze solid during the coldest part of winter. The people who lived here were not wealthy, but neither were they the desperately poor of urban slums or completely marginal lands. They were ordinary peasants, working the land, raising animals, practicing the crafts necessary for community survival, blacksmithing, carpentry, weaving, milling grain. They paid their rents to the Lord who owned the land, gave their tithes to the church, and kept what remained for their own survival. It was a hard life, but a sustainable one in normal years, a life that could be lived if you were strong and careful and fortunate enough to avoid the many disasters that could befall a medieval peasant family. But the winter of our story was not a normal winter. It had come early, settling in during October with snow that did not melt, with cold that deepened week by week until it seemed to have no bottom, no limit to how severe it could become. November brought storm after storm, each one adding to the snow already on the ground, until the drifts were taller than a man in some places, making travel between cottages difficult and travel beyond the village nearly impossible. By December, the village was effectively isolated, cut off from the larger world by snow and cold and the impossibility of moving through the frozen landscape. The harvest that previous autumn had been poor, damaged by early frost that came before the grain was fully ripened. What had been gathered and stored was not enough, and everyone knew it. Every family was rationing food, trying to make their supplies last until spring, knowing that some would not make it, that by the time the snow melted there would be fewer people in the village than there had been when winter began. Hunger was not yet starvation, but it was real and growing, a constant presence in every belly, a calculation that had to be made with every meal about how little could be eaten while still maintaining the strength needed for daily work. The animals were suffering too. Livestock had to be brought inside, into barns, or even into the cottages themselves, for their body heat helped warm the dwelling, and they were too valuable to risk losing to the cold. But feed was running low, and the animals were thin, their ribs visible through their hides, their milk production dropping as they struggled to maintain their own bodies on insufficient nutrition. Every dead animal meant not just the loss of that particular creature, but the loss of all it would have provided: milk, wool, breeding, labor in the fields come spring. But perhaps worst of all was the shortage of light. Fuel for candles was becoming scarce. The beeswax from the previous summer's harvest had been used up. The tallow from butchered animals was nearly gone, save for the most essential purposes. Families were going to bed earlier and earlier, not from sleepiness, but because sitting in darkness saved the candles that would be needed for work that could only be done with light. The long winter nights seemed to stretch forever, 15 or 16 hours of darkness during which there was nothing to do but sleep or sit in the cold and dark, waiting for dawn. In one of the smallest cottages at the edge of the village lived a widow. Her name, as is often the case in these old stories, varies in the telling. Sometimes she is called Agnes, sometimes Margaret, sometimes Cecilia. What remained constant was her situation. She was alone with 2 young children, trying to survive in circumstances that challenged even families with 2 parents and older children to help with the work. Her husband had died the previous winter, taken by a fever that had swept through the village, leaving her with the cottage, a small plot of land, a few possessions, and the crushing responsibility of keeping her children alive through a winter that seemed determined to kill anyone who showed weakness. She worked when she could, taking in spinning or mending, helping neighbors with tasks they would pay her for, accepting whatever charity was offered without letting pride prevent her children from eating. Her neighbors helped when they could, sharing what little they had, mindful of the Christian duty to care for widows and orphans. But this winter, no one had extra to share. Everyone was struggling. Everyone was hungry and cold and running out of everything: food, fuel, patience, hope. The widow's cottage was particularly bare. She had sold or traded most of what she owned of any value, keeping only what was absolutely necessary for survival. Her furniture was minimal: a rough table, a few stools, a pallet bed where she and her children slept huddled together for warmth. The hearth that should have held a welcoming fire more often held just embers, carefully banked to preserve the precious fuel that had to last through however many more months of winter remained. The walls were drafty despite her efforts to seal every crack, and frost often formed on the inside of the cottage during the coldest nights. But she had one candle left, a single beeswax candle, given to her by the priest weeks earlier, intended specifically for Christmas Eve. Beeswax was precious, far superior to tallow, burning cleaner and brighter, with a sweet smell that reminded people of summer and flowers and abundance. This candle was not large, perhaps the length of a hand, maybe less, but it was all she had, the only source of light beyond the faint glow of the banked fire, the only way to mark Christmas as different from any other dark, cold night. She kept the candle in a small niche in the wall, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth to protect it from moisture and mice. She looked at it sometimes, when the children were asleep and she sat alone in the darkness, trying to summon the courage to face another day, another night, another week of this endless winter. The candle represented choice, decision, the approaching moment when she would have to light it and watch it burn away, leaving her with nothing, no light to look forward to, no marker of hope, nothing but the darkness and the cold and the fear that they might not survive to see spring. Christmas was approaching, though it was hard to feel any sense of celebration or joy. The village was too hungry, too cold, too exhausted by the daily struggle of survival to manage the energy that festival required. There would be no feast, no abundance of food and drink, no elaborate decorations or gifts. There would be mass in the church, if people could make their way through the snow to attend. There would be prayers and hymns, the familiar rituals that connected this Christmas to all the Christmases that had come before. But the underlying mood was grim, shadowed by fear and loss and the knowledge that before the winter ended, some of those praying together on Christmas Eve would be dead. The widow thought about this as Christmas Eve approached. She thought about whether to light her candle at all, whether it might be more practical to save it, to use it when there was actual work that required light rather than spending it on a single night of ceremony and prayer. But something in her resisted this calculation, insisted that some things mattered more than strict practicality, that marking Christmas was important even when, especially when, circumstances were desperate, that maintaining faith and hope and connection to the sacred rhythms of the year was necessary for spiritual survival, even if it made no sense from a purely material standpoint. She decided she would light the candle on Christmas Eve. She would take her children to Mass if she could, or if the snow was too deep and the cold too severe, She would keep them home, and they would pray together by the candle's light, and it would be Christmas, and they would remember that Christ had been born in poverty, in a stable, to parents who had nowhere else to go, and that God had chosen to enter the world not in power and glory, but in vulnerability and humility, and that this meant something about divine love and divine care for people like her, people who had nothing, people who were cold and hungry and afraid. And so, as Christmas Eve dawned gray and cold, as the short winter day progressed toward its early darkness, the widow prepared herself and her children for what would come. She had saved a small amount of food for this day, not a feast, but a meal slightly better than what they had been eating, a gesture towards celebration even in their poverty. She tidied the cottage as best she could, making it as clean and orderly as possible with what she had. She brought out the candle, unwrapped it from its protective cloth, and placed it in the simple iron holder that had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before her, a piece of family history that connected her to generations of women who had also struggled through hard winters and somehow survived. As darkness fell and Christmas Eve truly began, the widow gathered her children close. They sat together at the small table, the unlit candle before them, and she explained what they would do. They would light this candle, their last candle, and it would burn for as long as it burned, and they would be grateful for its light however long it lasted. And they would remember that Christmas was about light coming into darkness, about God not abandoning his people, about hope that persisted even when circumstances suggested hopelessness. The children, thin and solemn beyond their years, nodded their understanding. They had learned not to ask for things that could not be given, not to complain about hunger or cold or fear, not to add to their mother's burdens by being difficult or demanding. They were good children, made better by hardship, more mature and aware than children should have to be, shaped by circumstances into small versions of adults who understood that life was difficult and survival required cooperation and acceptance of things that could not be changed. The widow struck the flint, caught the spark on a bit of charred cloth, carefully transferred the flame to a splinter of wood, and touched the splinter to the candle's wick. The wick caught, flared briefly, then settled into a steady glow. Yellow light spread through the cottage, pushing back the darkness, making visible things that had been lost in shadow. The candlelight was warm, not just in its appearance, but in the actual heat it generated, slight but noticeable, a small addition to the meager warmth from the dying fire. They sat together, the three of them, watching the candle burn, and the widow prayed. She prayed for strength to endure whatever remained of this winter. She prayed for her children, that they would survive, that they would grow to adulthood, and have better lives than she had managed to give them so far. She prayed for the soul of her husband, gone now a year, but still so present in her memory that sometimes she forgot he was dead, sometimes turned to speak to him before remembering he was not there and would never be there again. She prayed for the village, for all the families struggling through this terrible winter, for the sick and the dying and those who had already died. And she prayed with gratitude, thanking God for what they did have, shelter, however humble, each other. This one candle burning on Christmas Eve, the faith that sustained her when nothing else could. The candle burned steadily, its flame bright and true, consuming the wax as candles do, growing slowly shorter as the hours passed, and Christmas Eve moved toward Christmas morning. The widow expected it to last perhaps 4 hours, maybe 5 if they were fortunate, before the wick drowned in its own wax or burned down to nothing. They would have light for this one evening, this one holy night, and then it would be gone, and they would return to darkness, and life would continue somehow, in whatever form it took. But something was happening that the widow did not yet realize, something that would only become apparent as the night wore on and the expected shortening of the candle did not occur. The flame burned, bright and steady, but the wax seemed not to diminish, or if it did, so slowly that the change was imperceptible. The hours passed, 1, 2, 3, 4, and still the candle glowed with the same brightness. Still the wick stood at the same height. Still the wax formed the same shape it had when first lit. The widow noticed first, though she doubted what her eyes were telling her, assuming she was mistaken about how long the candle had been burning or how large it had been to begin with. But as midnight approached and then passed, as Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, as the night deepened and the cold intensified, and still the candle burned without visible diminishment. She began to understand that something extraordinary was occurring, something that defied natural explanation, something that could only be described as miracle. The widow sat very still, watching the candle with intensity that was part disbelief and part dawning wonder. She had lit countless candles in her life, had watched them burn from new to spent hundreds of times, knew intimately how a candle behaved as it consumed itself, the way the wax melted and pulled, the way the wick gradually shortened, the way the flame flickered and changed as it approached the end of its fuel. This candle was not behaving as candles behave. She measured it with her eyes, tried to judge whether it was actually the same height as when she had lit it hours ago, or whether she was fooling herself, seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. But the more she watched, the more certain she became. The candle was not getting shorter. The wax was not diminishing. The flame burned with the same vigor it had shown at first lighting, showing no signs of the weakening that should occur as fuel runs low. Her children had fallen asleep, exhausted by the day and lulled by the warmth and light, their small bodies pressed against her for comfort and heat. She let them sleep, did not wake them to witness what was happening, not yet certain that what she was seeing was real, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed if the candle suddenly behaved normally and burned down to nothing in a rush of final flame. The night hours passed slowly, as winter night hours do when you are cold and tired and have nothing to do but sit in the darkness. But the widow was not bored or restless. She was mesmerized by the candle, by its impossible persistence, by the growing certainty that she was witnessing something that should not be possible according to the natural order of things. The candle should be half gone by now, 3/4 gone, burned down to a stub. Instead, it looked almost exactly as it had when she first lit it, as if the flame were consuming nothing, as if the wax were being restored as fast as it melted, as if some force was actively maintaining the candle in its initial state. As dawn approached, as the faintest gray light began to show through the cracks in the shutters, the widow finally allowed herself to fully believe what she had been seeing all night. The candle had burned for 6, 7, 8 hours, burning continuously without pause, and it was not consumed. It was not getting smaller. The wick was not shorter. The wax was not less. This was miracle, undeniable and present, occurring in her cottage, on her table, providing light for her and her children on this Christmas morning. She woke her children gently, whispered to them that something extraordinary had happened, pointed to the candle that should be burned down to nothing but still glowed bright and whole. The children, still foggy with sleep, did not immediately understand. But as they became more alert, as they looked at the candle and then at their mother's face and then back at the candle, they began to grasp that something unusual was occurring, that their mother was not merely being hopeful or imaginative, but was witnessing something real. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 8 years, asked in a whisper whether the candle was magical. The widow shook her head, said no, it was not magic, but miracle, not sorcery, but grace, not something to be feared, but something to be grateful for, something that came from God, not from any dark or dangerous source. She explained as best she could what miracle meant, how sometimes the natural order was gently set aside to provide what was desperately needed, how divine love could manifest in physical form, how what they were seeing was a gift, grace made visible and tangible. Christmas Day dawned fully, the weak winter sun rising to illuminate a world still deep in snow and cold. The widow and her children ate their small meal, said their prayers, sang the Christmas hymns they knew, all in the glow of the candle that should not still be burning but was. The light from the candle seemed brighter in daylight than candlelight should be, seemed to fill the cottage with a warmth that went beyond the physical heat it generated, seemed to create an atmosphere of peace and safety that was more felt than seen. Word began to spread through the village. The widow had mentioned to a neighbor that her candle was still burning, had shown it to a woman who came to borrow something, and that woman had told her husband, who had told others. And soon there were people coming to the cottage to see for themselves this candle that would not burn down, this impossible light that persisted beyond all natural possibility. The villagers came, stomping snow from their boots, bringing cold air in with them that was quickly warmed by the overcrowded cottage and the heat of the assembled bodies. They stood in the small space, staring at the candle, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some reached out to touch the candle, as if physical contact would reveal some trick or natural explanation that sight alone could not detect. But the candle was simply a candle, beeswax and wick and flame. Nothing obviously unusual except that it would not consume itself, would not burn down, would not obey the fundamental law that fire requires fuel and fuel diminishes when burnt. The priest came, alerted by his parishioners that something extraordinary was occurring in the widow's cottage. He was an old man, gray and bent, who had served this village for decades, who had baptized and married and buried most of the people who lived here, who had seen all manner of human joy and suffering and everything in between. He approached the candle with professional skepticism, aware that people in desperate times often see what they want to see, that grief and hunger and fear can create visions that seem real, but are not. But as he examined the candle, as he questioned the widow about when she had lit it and how long it had been burning, as he compared what she described to what his own experience told him was possible, he found himself forced to conclude that what the villagers believed was actually true. This candle had been burning for well over 12 hours now, perhaps approaching 15 or 16, and it showed no signs of consumption, no diminishment in size or weight or vigor of flame. By any natural standard, it should have burned down to nothing hours ago. Its persistence was inexplicable, impossible, miraculous. The priest stood before the candle and prayed, thanking God for this sign of divine presence, for this small miracle granted to a poor widow and her children, for this light that had come to a village that desperately needed any sign of hope, any reason to believe that they were not abandoned to the darkness and cold and hunger that surrounded them. He prayed that the meaning of this miracle would be understood, not just that a candle burned longer than it should, but that God's care extended to the smallest and poorest, that faith was rewarded, that hope was justified even when circumstances seemed hopeless. As the day progressed, more and more villagers found their way to the widow's cottage. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see for themselves what everyone was talking about. Others came seeking comfort, hoping that witnessing a miracle would strengthen their own faltering faith, would give them the courage to endure whatever remained of this terrible winter. Some came because being in the presence of something holy felt necessary, felt like the right response to Christmas Day and to the remarkable thing that was happening in their midst. The cottage became a pilgrimage site, a place of gathering and prayer. People stayed as long as they could spare the time from their own necessary work, standing or sitting in the crowded space, warming themselves by the press of bodies and the small fire and the candle that continued to burn hour after hour without diminishment. They sang hymns together, the old Christmas songs that everyone knew, the melodies that connected this moment to all the Christmases that had come before and all that would come after. They prayed together, some aloud and some in silence, each offering whatever words or thoughts seemed appropriate to the miracle they were witnessing. The widow, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her quiet, lonely Christmas into this communal celebration, tried to be hospitable despite having almost nothing to offer. She had no food to share beyond the small amount she had saved for her children. She had no drink beyond water from the well. She had no seats for all these people, no space for them to be comfortable. But no one complained or expected anything beyond permission to be present, to witness, to participate in whatever was happening in this humble cottage that had become, for this day, the center of the village's spiritual life. As Christmas Day moved toward evening, as the short winter daylight faded and darkness returned, the candle still burned. It had now been glowing for more than 24 hours, a full day and night, consuming no wax, shortening not at all, defying every natural law that governed how fire and fuel interact. Some villagers had stayed in the cottage all day, watching in shifts, ensuring that no trick or deception was occurring, that the candle was not being replaced or added to or maintained by any human intervention. But there was no trick. The candle simply continued burning, steadily and brightly, a light that would not die, a flame that would not be extinguished. The widow barely slept that night, too amazed to rest, too grateful to do anything but watch the candle and pray. Her children slept beside her, warm for once, full for once because neighbors had shared what little they had, bringing scraps of food and bits of fuel for the fire, giving to the widow as she had received from heaven, multiplying the miracle in small, human ways. And through it all, The candle burned, its light filling the cottage, pushing back darkness both physical and spiritual, offering warmth and hope to everyone who saw it. The second day of Christmas arrived, and still the candle burned. The widow woke to find it exactly as it had been when sleep finally claimed her in the early hours, glowing steadily, the wick still tall, the wax still formed in its original shape. She had dreamed that it had gone out, had woken in panic thinking the miracle was over, only to find the light still present, still impossible, still real. More villagers came that day, including some who had been too ill or too far away to come on Christmas Day itself. They came leaning on walking sticks, supported by family members, wrapped in every bit of clothing and covering they owned, determined to witness the miracle despite the difficulty of the journey through snow and cold. They came because they needed to see it, needed to know that impossible things could happen, that the natural order could be suspended, that divine intervention was real and present and might extend to other desperate needs beyond a single candle's burning. Among those who came was a young mother whose infant had been sick for weeks, wasting away despite everything she tried to do to help him. She brought the baby to the cottage, held him up to the candlelight as if the light itself might have healing properties, as if exposure to miracle might cure what medicine and prayer had so far failed to cure. The baby was tiny and frighteningly still, his breathing shallow, his skin pale, his eyes dull. The mother wept as she held him, her tears dropping onto the infant's face, mixing with her desperate prayers for his survival. The widow, moved by the mother's anguish, invited her to sit close to the candle, to stay as long as she needed, to rest and warm herself and her baby by the light that would not die. The young mother sat, cradling her infant, rocking him gently, singing to him in a voice broken by tears and exhaustion. The other villagers present made room for her, created space closest to the candle, understanding without words that she needed this more than they did, that her desperation exceeded their own. Hours passed. The baby seemed to rest more peacefully than he had in days, his breathing deepening slightly, his body relaxing against his mother's chest. Whether this was the effect of warmth and his mother's calm or something more, something connected to the miracle of the candle itself, no one could say with certainty. But the young mother felt a shift, a subtle change in her child that gave her hope she had not felt in weeks. When she finally left the cottage late that afternoon, she carried the infant with renewed faith that he might survive, that the terrible waiting for his death might end differently than she had feared. The priest returned daily, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes just briefly checking that the miracle continued. He brought his small portable altar and held mass in the cottage. The liturgy conducted in the presence of the miraculous candle, the familiar Latin words taking on additional meaning in this context, the prayers of thanksgiving carrying extra weight, because there was something tangible to be grateful for, visible evidence of divine care. Villagers crowded into the cottage for these masses, standing shoulder to shoulder, kneeling on the cold floor, participating in the sacred ritual while the miraculous candle burned on, silent witness to the human prayers rising around it. The priest also brought his writing materials and documented what was happening, recording the testimony of the widow and others who had witnessed the candles burning from the beginning. He wrote down the date it had been lit, the hour as near as could be determined, the length and thickness of the candle before lighting, the number of hours it had now burned. He collected statements from multiple witnesses, creating a record that could be preserved and perhaps, someday, submitted to higher church authorities as evidence of a genuine miracle. Medieval people understood that miracles required documentation if they were to be believed by those who had not witnessed them directly. The church had processes for evaluating claimed miracles, standards of evidence that had to be met before something could be officially recognized as divine intervention rather than natural occurrence or fraud. The priest, trained in these matters, knew what would be required if this miracle were to be formally acknowledged, and he was preparing that groundwork even as the miracle itself continued to unfold. On the third day, the candle still burned. By now it had been glowing for nearly 70 hours, 3 full days and nights without the slightest sign of consumption or weakening. The impossibility of this was staggering. Even the finest beeswax candle of this size would have burned down completely in a quarter of that time. The laws of nature said this could not be happening. Yet it was happening, witnessed by dozens of people, documented by a priest, undeniable in its reality, however impossible in its execution. The village began to change in subtle ways. People who had been withdrawn into their own suffering started connecting with neighbors again, sharing what little they had, helping each other with necessary tasks. The miracle had reminded them that they were a community, that isolation made everything harder, that sharing even meager resources created abundance that hoarding could never achieve. Families that had been barely speaking to each other over old grievances found themselves standing together in the widow's cottage, their disputes seeming petty in the face of divine grace that cared nothing for human quarrels. Food began appearing at the widow's door, not feasts or even full meals, but small offerings from families who had almost nothing. A handful of dried beans, a few withered apples from the bottom of a barrel, a small piece of salt pork, carefully rationed from stores that needed to last until spring. Each gift represented real sacrifice, families giving away food they needed for themselves, choosing generosity over self-preservation, multiplying the miracle of the candle into human acts of kindness and solidarity. The widow tried to refuse these gifts, insisting that others needed them more than she did, that the miracle of the candle did not mean she deserved charity that should go to those who had nothing. But the villagers pressed the offerings on her anyway, explaining that giving was part of the miracle, that the candle had taught them something about generosity and faith, that they wanted to respond to grace by being gracious themselves. She finally accepted, understanding that to refuse would be to deny them the opportunity to participate in the sacred work that the candle had begun. The widow also began to share her cottage more deliberately, inviting the most vulnerable villagers to spend time in the warmth and light rather than sitting alone in their own cold, dark houses. The elderly who lived alone and had no one to help them came and sat by the candle, warming their arthritic hands, resting their tired eyes on the gentle flame, finding comfort in community and in the tangible evidence that they were not forgotten, that divine care extended even to them in their frailty and their fear. Children came with their parents, sitting quietly in the candlelight, listening to the adults talk and pray, absorbing the atmosphere of miracle even if they did not fully understand what was happening. These children would carry this memory for the rest of their lives, would tell their own children and grandchildren about the winter when they were young and saw a candle that would not die, when they witnessed something that should have been impossible but was undeniably real. The candle's light seemed to affect more than just the immediate physical space. People reported feeling different in its presence, less afraid, more hopeful, more connected to something larger than their individual struggles. Whether this was psychological, the effect of suggestion and shared experience, or something genuinely supernatural, some quality of the miracle extending beyond the physical fact of the candle's persistence, remained a matter of debate among those who analyzed the event in later years. But for those who were there, in that cottage, in that winter, the effect was undeniable. The light brought warmth not just to bodies but to spirits, offered hope not just through its symbolic meaning but through its actual presence, created community through shared witness to something extraordinary. As the fourth and fifth days passed, the miracle continued without variation. The candle burned with the same bright, steady flame, showing no signs of the weakening or flickering that would indicate it was approaching its natural end. The priest continued his documentation, continued holding services in the cottage, continued marveling at the persistence of something that defied all his experience and learning. He began to speak of the candle as a sign specifically meant for this time and place, for this village in this winter, evidence that their suffering had been seen and noted, that their prayers had been heard, that they were not abandoned to face the darkness alone. Some villagers began bringing their own candles to the cottage, lighting them from the miraculous flame, hoping that some quality of the miracle might transfer to their own lights. Whether these derivative candles burned any longer than natural candles would burn remained unclear. Some claimed they did, others said they burned normally, but the act of lighting them from the miraculous source created a sense of connection, a way of taking a piece of the miracle home, of extending its influence beyond the widow's cottage into other households and hearts. The widow herself remained somewhat overwhelmed by everything that was happening. Her cottage, which had been a place of quiet struggle and private suffering, had become the center of village life, a gathering place, a church of sorts, a location where the sacred visibly intersected with the ordinary. She had not sought this attention, had lit the candle expecting it to burn for a few hours and then go out, leaving her in darkness as before. Instead, she had become the guardian of a miracle, the keeper of a flame that would not die, and with that came responsibilities and attention she had never anticipated. But she bore it all with grace, welcoming visitors even when she was exhausted, allowing the priest to use her cottage for services even when she would have preferred solitude, accepting the food and fuel that neighbors brought even when pride said she should refuse. She understood, at some level deeper than conscious thought, that the miracle was not really about her, that she had been chosen not because she was especially deserving, but because someone had to be chosen, because miracles must happen somewhere and to someone, and God had selected her cottage and her candle and her Christmas Eve for reasons she did not need to understand to accept with gratitude. The days continued to pass, and still the candle burned. Each morning the widow woke expecting to find it extinguished, the miracle over, life returning to its normal patterns of darkness and cold. But each morning the flame still glowed, steady and bright, maintaining its impossible persistence. 6 days, 7, 8, 9. The villagers stopped asking when it would go out and began instead to wonder if it would ever go out, if this candle might burn forever, a permanent light in their village, an eternal reminder of the Christmas when grace had manifested so tangibly. Different versions of this story offer different accounts of how long the candle burned. In some tellings, it lasted exactly 12 days, from Christmas Eve through Epiphany, the full liturgical celebration of Christmas that honored both Christ's birth and the visit of the Magi. This 12-day period had deep symbolic significance in medieval Christianity, representing the time between incarnation and revelation, between the private birth in Bethlehem and the public manifestation to the wider world that the Magi's visit symbolized. In other versions, the candle burned until the winter storm that had isolated the village finally broke, until warmer weather arrived and the snow began to melt and travel became possible again. This variant emphasized the candle as provision specifically for the time of greatest need, lasting exactly as long as the crisis lasted and no longer, grace calibrated perfectly to necessity. Still other accounts say the candle burned until the young mother's sick infant finally recovered fully, until the baby who had seemed certain to die instead began eating and gaining weight and showing the vigor of healthy infancy. In these versions, the candle was understood as a sign connected specifically to that child, a light that would not die until the life it symbolically protected was no longer in danger. What remained constant across all versions was that the candle eventually did go out, that the miracle was temporary rather than permanent, that it lasted exactly as long as it was meant to last, and then ended. This ending was important to the story's meaning. If the candle had burned forever, it would have been too much, would have overshadowed the quiet beauty of the miracle with its own spectacle. The fact that it ended reminded everyone that miracles are gifts, not permanent alterations of reality, signs that point to larger truths rather than becoming objects of worship themselves. In the version that follows the liturgical 12 days, the candle burned through all the traditional celebrations of the Christmas season. It glowed through the feast of St. Stephen on December 26th, through the feast of St. John on the 27th, through the feast of the Holy Innocents on the 28th. It burned as the year changed from one to another, its light carrying over into the new year, suggesting continuity and connection between past and future. It burned through New Year's Day and the days following, maintaining its steady glow as the village slowly recovered from the isolation and fear that had characterized the worst of the winter. During these days, the cottage remained a gathering place, though the initial rush of visitors had settled into a more sustainable pattern. Some villagers came daily, making it part of their routine to spend time in the presence of the miraculous light. Others came less frequently but still regularly, checking on the candle, praying, warming themselves physically and spiritually. The widow's cottage had become an unofficial chapel, a place of pilgrimage within the village, a space set apart from ordinary life even though it remained an ordinary cottage in most respects. The priest organized a schedule of prayer, ensuring that someone was present at all hours to witness the miracle and to offer prayers of thanksgiving. Villagers took shifts, sitting with the candle through the night hours when the widow and her children needed to sleep, maintaining a vigil that honored the sacred nature of what was occurring. These night watchers reported feeling a special sense of peace in the dark hours, sitting in the quiet cottage with only the candles glow, feeling connected to the divine presence that manifested through this small, persistent flame. As Epiphany approached, January 6th, the official end of the Christmas season, there was a sense of anticipation mixed with sadness. Everyone understood that the miracle would likely end, that the candle would go out, and they would return to ordinary life with its ordinary struggles. But there was also gratitude for what they had experienced, for the days of light and hope and community that the candle had created, for the way it had transformed their darkest winter into something sacred and memorable. On the eve of Epiphany, the priest held a special service in the widow's cottage, gathering as many villagers as could fit into the small space, with others standing outside in the cold, listening through the walls and the open door. He spoke about light and darkness, about how Christ had come as light into the world's darkness, about how this candle had been a sign of that larger truth, a small mirror reflecting the great reality of divine love and care. He spoke about the Magi following a star, about how they had traveled far to witness and honor the birth of Christ, and about how the villagers had traveled much shorter distances, but with similar devotion to witness and honor this small miracle in their midst. The service ended with prayers of thanksgiving, with hymns sung by voices that had grown familiar with each other over these days of shared vigil, with a blessing pronounced over the candle and the cottage and the widow and her children and all who had witnessed or benefited from this extraordinary event. And as the service concluded, as the villagers began to make their way home through the cold night, the candle continued to burn, glowing steadily as it had for 12 days and nights without diminishment or variation. The widow and her children settled into sleep that night with the candle still glowing beside them, familiar now, its light having been a constant presence for nearly 2 weeks. They had grown accustomed to it, had stopped being startled by its persistence, had integrated the miracle into their daily life until it almost seemed normal, just another aspect of their routine. But the widow knew it could not last forever, knew that at some point the natural order would reassert itself, that the candle would burn down and go out, and they would return to darkness. She woke before dawn on Epiphany morning, roused by something she could not name, a sense that something had changed. She looked immediately to the candle, and in the pre-dawn darkness, she could see that it still burned, but differently now. The flame was smaller, dimmer, flickering in a way it had not flickered before. The wax, which had remained constant for 12 days, was finally beginning to melt and run, pulling at the base of the candle as wax should. The wick, which had stayed tall and straight, was starting to bend and darken as wicks do when they approach the end of their fuel. The widow watched as the miracle gently ended, as the candle that had burned beyond all natural possibility finally surrendered to natural law, as the flame grew smaller and weaker, as the last bit of wax melted away, as the wick consumed itself, and the flame wavered and shrank and finally, peacefully, went out. There was no drama to it, no sudden extinction, just a gradual fading as the candle burned down in the normal way, completing in a few minutes what should have happened 12 days earlier. Dawn was breaking as the candle died, morning light beginning to filter through the cottage shutters, replacing the candlelight with natural illumination. The widow sat in the growing daylight, looking at the candle holder that now held only a small puddle of cooled wax and a blackened wick, the last remnants of the miracle that had illuminated her cottage and her village for 12 extraordinary days. She felt grief at its ending, but also peace, understanding that it had lasted exactly as long as it was meant to last, that its completion was part of its meaning, that the ending made the miracle finite and therefore more precious. She woke her children and told them the candle had gone out, that the miracle was over. They looked at the empty holder with sadness, but also with something that might have been relief, the release of tension that comes when waiting finally ends, when anticipation resolves into reality. They had witnessed something extraordinary, had been at the center of something sacred, and now it was done, complete, ready to become memory and story. The priest came later that morning and confirmed what the widow had told him. The candle had burned out naturally just after dawn on Epiphany, ending the miracle on the traditional last day of the Christmas season. He collected the remains of the candle, the small bits of wax and the blackened wick, wrapping them carefully in cloth to be preserved as relics, physical evidence of the miracle that could be kept and perhaps, someday, displayed or given to church authorities as proof of what had occurred in this small village during this terrible winter. Word spread quickly through the village that the candle had gone out, that the miracle was over. People came to the cottage to see for themselves, to confirm the ending, and many felt the same mixture of sadness and peace that the widow had experienced. The miracle had been a gift, freely given and freely concluded when its time had ended. There was no sense of divine abandonment in its ending, no feeling that God had withdrawn care or attention. Rather, there was understanding that the candle had served its purpose, had provided light for exactly as long as that light was most needed. And now the village could continue forward, strengthened by what they had witnessed, better able to endure whatever remained of winter, because they had been shown so clearly that they were not alone in their struggles. In the years and centuries after the Christmas candle miracle, as the story was told and retold, as it spread beyond the original village to other communities and other regions, people found in it meanings that resonated with their own experiences and their own understanding of faith and divine action in the world. The story became part of the great treasury of medieval miracle tales, those narratives that preserved and transmitted the collective spiritual wisdom of Christian communities across Europe. Medieval people understood candles as profoundly symbolic objects, carrying meanings that went far beyond their practical function as sources of light. Every time a candle was lit in a church or a home, it represented multiple things simultaneously: prayer rising to heaven, the light of faith in the darkness of sin, the soul's journey through earthly life, Christ as light of the world, the presence of the divine in ordinary circumstances. A single candle could be all these things at once, functioning as physical object and spiritual symbol without contradiction or confusion. The miracle of the candle that would not burn out therefore operated on multiple levels. On the physical level, it was divine provision of light during a time when light was desperately needed, grace meeting a material need in a tangible way. But symbolically it meant so much more. It was faith that persisted when circumstances suggested faith was unreasonable. It was hope that refused to die even in the darkest times. It was divine presence maintaining itself in a world that seemed abandoned to cold and darkness and suffering. It was the promise that some lights cannot be extinguished, that some flames will not die no matter how strong the winds of adversity blow against them. The fact that the miracle came to a poor widow was significant in multiple ways. Widows represented vulnerability in medieval society, lacking the male protection and provision that social structures assumed all women needed. They were dependent on charity, on the goodness of neighbors, on their own resourcefulness and the grace of God. That a miracle would come to such a person reinforced the biblical pattern of divine care for widows and orphans, the consistent message that God's attention extends particularly to those whom society overlooks or marginalizes. The 12-day duration of the miracle in the most common version of the story carried its own symbolic weight. 12 was a number rich with biblical and theological significance. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, the 12 days connecting Christmas and Epiphany. The candle burning for exactly 12 days suggested perfect divine timing, grace calibrated not to human expectation, but to sacred rhythms, to the liturgical calendar that structured medieval Christian life and gave shape to time itself. The communal aspect of the miracle was also crucial to its meaning. The candle did not burn privately, witnessed only by the widow and her children. It became a gathering point, a reason for community formation, a catalyst for mutual aid and shared devotion. The miracle created community as much as it created light, bringing isolated, suffering families out of their private struggles into shared experience, reminding them that they were stronger together than alone, that bearing witness collectively to divine grace strengthened bonds between neighbors and increased everyone's capacity to endure hardship. The temporary nature of the miracle taught something important about the nature of divine intervention. Miracles in medieval understanding were not permanent alterations of reality, but temporary suspensions of natural law, signs pointing to larger truths rather than becoming new natural laws themselves. The candle eventually burned out because that was always part of its purpose, to provide light for a specific time, to meet a particular need, and then to end, leaving behind memory and meaning, but not permanent dependence on supernatural provision. This pattern, miracle granted, miracle completed, returned to ordinary life enriched by extraordinary experience, characterized many medieval miracle stories. It suggested that divine intervention was not meant to eliminate the challenges of earthly life, but to strengthen people's capacity to face those challenges, not to remove them from the world's darkness, but to remind them that light exists and can be kindled and will persist even when circumstances suggest otherwise. The story also taught about generosity and multiplication, themes that ran through many medieval miracle tales. The widow had one candle, her last source of light, and she chose to light it rather than hoard it, to use it for celebration and prayer rather than saving it for some future practical need. This choice to give rather than keep, to use rather than preserve, to light rather than hide in darkness, opened the door to grace. The miracle rewarded not self-preservation but self-giving, not calculation but faith, not prudence but generosity. And the miracle multiplied in human terms through the food and fuel that villagers brought to the widow, through the sharing that the candle inspired, through the way witnessing grace led to practicing grace, imitating divine generosity through small human acts of kindness and solidarity. The light of one candle became the warmth of many hearts. The illumination of one cottage spread through many lives. The miracle expanded beyond its immediate physical manifestation into a network of human connection and mutual care. As we come to the end of this story, as we prepare to leave that medieval village and return to our own time and place, it is worth reflecting on what this ancient tale offers to us. So many centuries removed from the world that gave it birth, so different in our circumstances, yet perhaps not so different in our needs. We do not face the literal darkness that medieval people faced, most of us. We have electric lights that banish night at the flip of a switch, heating systems that maintain comfortable temperatures regardless of the weather outside, food supplies that remain constant throughout the year. We are sheltered from the harsh realities that made winter a genuine trial of survival for our ancestors. The darkness we face is of a different kind. Spiritual darkness, the absence of meaning, the cold that comes from isolation and disconnection, the hunger that is not for bread, but for purpose and community and hope. The Christmas candle story speaks to these modern forms of darkness and cold and hunger. It reminds us that light matters, that even small lights have significance, that a single candle can illuminate more than just physical space. It suggests that persistence is its own kind of miracle, that staying lit when everything around us is dark is an act of faith and courage, that continuing to shine when all logic says we should be exhausted is evidence of grace operating through us. The widow in the story did not know her candle would become miraculous when she lit it. She lit it because it was Christmas Eve, because marking sacred time mattered even when, especially when, circumstances were desperate, because maintaining connection to hope and faith and tradition was necessary for spiritual survival, even if it made no practical sense. Her choice to light rather than hoard, to use rather than preserve, created the conditions for miracle. We might learn from this that our own small choices to kindle light, to maintain hope, to practice faith despite circumstances, are more significant than they seem, that they open doors to grace we cannot predict or control. The way the village gathered around the candle, the community that formed in response to the miracle, speaks to our modern isolation and fragmentation. We live in a time of unprecedented connection through technology, yet profound disconnection in terms of actual human community. We have more ways to communicate than ever before, but often feel more alone. The story suggests that shared witness to something larger than ourselves, collective recognition of grace or beauty or meaning, creates bonds between people that individual pursuits cannot generate, that we need to gather around our own equivalents of the miraculous candle, finding and creating spaces where community forms around shared experience of the sacred. The temporary nature of the miracle reminds us that grace comes when it is needed and departs when its work is complete, that we cannot possess or control the miraculous, that our relationship to divine intervention is one of reception and gratitude rather than demand or entitlement. The candle burned for 12 days and then went out, and that ending was part of its meaning. It had provided light for the darkest time, had strengthened the community for what lay ahead, and then it concluded, leaving the village to continue forward with what they had learned, with the memory of light to sustain them through future darkness. We might apply this to our own lives, understanding that the extraordinary moments, the times when we feel clearly held, when grace manifests tangibly, when light breaks through our darkness in undeniable ways, are temporary gifts meant to sustain us through the longer periods of ordinary life, when divine presence is less obvious, but no less real. The miracle teaches us to receive these moments with gratitude without demanding that they last forever, to let them shape us without becoming dependent on constant supernatural intervention. The image of the candle itself invites contemplation. What are the candles we need to light? What lights are we called to maintain despite the winds of adversity? What illumination can we offer to others who sit in darkness? The story suggests that sometimes our small lights, offered with faith and maintained with persistence, can become miraculous not because we possess special power, but because grace works through ordinary means when they are offered with generous hearts. As dawn breaks over that medieval village on Epiphany morning, as the miraculous candle finally burns down to nothing, as the widow and her children wake to natural light after 12 days of supernatural illumination, we can see in their experience a pattern that repeats across human history. We face our darkest times. We kindle our small lights. We maintain them as best we can. And sometimes, mysteriously, impossibly, those lights persist beyond all natural possibility, sustained by forces we cannot name, but can recognize and receive with gratitude. The candle is out now, has been out for centuries, the wax long since melted away, the wick long since consumed, the miracle completed and passed into memory and story. But the light it represents has not gone out, cannot go out, because it was never merely about one candle in one cottage in one medieval winter. It was always about something larger, about hope that persists, about faith that endures, about light that cannot be finally or fully extinguished no matter how dark the world becomes. May this old story kindle something in your own heart, a light of hope or faith or simple wonder that the world contains more than what we can see and measure and explain. May you find courage to light your own candles despite the darkness around you, to maintain your own small flames despite the winds that blow against them. May you discover, as that widow discovered, that sometimes our small offerings become vehicles for grace beyond our understanding, that our humble lights can illuminate more than we imagine possible. And may you remember, in your own darkest hours, that light has a way of persisting, of continuing when all logic says it should fail, of burning longer than natural law allows because grace operates according to rules deeper than nature's rules, because love sustains what fear says is impossible, because some flames, once kindled, refuse to die until their work is complete. The Christmas candle that never burned out is more than a story from long ago. It is a promise that light persists, that hope endures, that in our darkest winters we are not alone, that small flames matter, that grace still operates in quiet ways, that miracles can be as simple and as profound as a candle burning one more day, one more hour, one more moment than it should, offering light when light is most needed, warmth when cold threatens to overwhelm, hope when despair seems reasonable. May your own candles burn long and bright. May their light reach further than you imagine. And may you be both giver and receiver of the light that will not die, the warmth that persists, the hope that endures through all our winters until spring comes at last.